Hello, and thank you so much for joining me today on the Compassion Fatigue podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Blau. You are listening to session number 2. My guest today is Dr. Carrie LaJeunesse. She has just an incredible wealth of knowledge and insight into the human-animal bond and specifically how that impacts compassion fatigue. She's the owner of LaJeunesse Consulting, and Dr. Carrie works across the biomedical, social, and behavioral sciences. As a veterinarian, she practiced primarily small companion animal emergency and critical care medicine for 30 years. She works internationally to advance health, well-being, and security for people and animals around the world. Dr. LaJeunesse is also certified in thanatology, which is basically the study of death, dying, and bereavement, as well as compassion fatigue education, and she is a commissioned spiritual director. Through her private practice, Carrie works with individuals, organizations, and communities on psychosocial trauma mastery, bereavement and loss, conflict transformation, and spiritual care. Her interdisciplinary international policy and program work to address hunger, poverty, disease, crises, and environmental issues, and has taken her to West Africa, Southeast Asia, Europe, and Central America. So without further ado, I bring you Dr. Carrie LaJeunesse. Carrie, welcome to the Compassion Fatigue podcast.
Thank you. Very happy to be with you this morning.
So I just read your intro there, and you have an absolutely amazing background. Can you tell us a little bit what led you to want to work with animals in the first place?
Well, I was one of the lucky ones that had interest across a lot of fields. So interested in law and oceanography and working with people in medicine and animals. And veterinary medicine, at that time at least, was the only profession that I could find where I could combine that love of science and medicine and animals and working with people. So if I hadn't been able to get into veterinary school, I would have applied for med school. But of course, I'm very happy that I was accepted to vet school. It's been a great career.
And so when did you first discover that compassion fatigue was such a serious problem within the animal care field?
So I think I recognized that it was an issue probably around 1987, I'm going to say 1987, 1988, but there wasn't really a word for it then. I just noticed what was happening to myself and also to some of my colleagues. And it wasn't until probably the late 90s that I learned about it officially and started working in that arena and studying it then.
And so do you mind me asking how you experienced it personally, or maybe what you saw in some of your colleagues?
Sure. And I should qualify, I may not have actually ever reached the point of compassion fatigue, but certainly compassion stress, and sort of expand on that a little bit. There's still a lot of debate for your listeners. There's still a lot of debate, I'm sure, as you know, about the terminology around compassion fatigue. Some people are calling it empathy fatigue now. So I think the bottom line is it's more important to understand the concepts and how people might be affected. So for me, when I first noticed things happening around 1987, 1988, I had suffered a lot of personal losses. So 5 very good friends had died. My very favorite first very own dog had died. Had a miscarriage. And so there was a combination of work-related things. I was doing mostly emergency and critical care medicine, also had a house call practice, and a large part of that was home euthanasia. So there's just a lot of loss going on at one time. And then the other thing is everybody brings their background with them as well. So I had some personal background growing up where there was some trauma involved with that. And so it just sort of was a perfect storm. And ultimately, I was really lucky. I resourced myself very early on with a great counselor who was the one that ultimately ended up helping me start studying these issues with what was available in the literature at the time. And that was really helpful to me.
I think you were very lucky to find a counselor that understood that, because I think, back in those days, we weren't talking about it in terms of compassion stress or compassion fatigue, especially within the animal welfare industry. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree. And it was further interesting, I think, in that the guy I was working with at the time, our focus at that point with the work that I was doing with him was things around grief and loss, because that's how the sense of that was manifesting for me. So at the time, the resources that he pointed to me were considered to be pretty much on the fringe, outside of what people were normally doing with counseling. And as it turns out, those have become, over the past 20 years or so, fundamental resources for people that are experiencing these sort of holistic reactions to the stress that they're facing. So yes, I was very, very lucky.
Yeah, because, I'm sure that many, if not all, really, of the helping professions are vulnerable to compassion fatigue. This started with researching trauma nurses, but what makes animal work in particular maybe a little bit different or unique?
Well, first of all, it's entirely wonderful. So I think that when we look at statistics around this, there was some work done by Figley and Roop, as you probably know, several years ago, looking specifically at folks in the animal care industry. And they found some things that I think are quite unique and interesting. One is that at least veterinarians and technicians are also have a very high opportunity for compassion satisfaction. So that joy and sense of worth that we get from working in our jobs, very, very high potential for that in the animal care community. Also, a pretty high risk for compassion fatigue, but the two sometimes seem to balance each other out. That's probably the only thing that's really been elucidated in the animal care profession. There's a lot of speculation about why we might be at higher risk, but that work hasn't really been done to elucidate that any further.
And do you think part of that risk has to do with the fact that there's a human-animal bond that happens within, whether it's shelter work or veterinary care? You are bound to form attachments to these animals in your care. And with those attachments, inevitably comes loss. Could you just kind of expand more on the significance of the human-animal bond?
Well, of course, I can't be very objective about this particular subject because it's near and dear to my heart. Of course, especially as veterinarians, we're the only profession that works really, really hard to prevent illness and keep animals healthy through a lifetime, and then intentionally end their lives when they're suffering at the end of their lives. So, looking at that from a scientific standpoint hasn't really been done, but I will tell you experientially, of course, it's very difficult. And I think people who are effective in managing that understand that that's part of what we do, and that there's a profound benefit to end suffering when we can provide a euthanasia service for a patient and for a client. Uniquely speaking, I guess, there is a profound sense, I think, of unconditional love and acceptance. And those aren't things that we often encounter in our relationships with people. I think sometimes we do in very special relationships, but that sense of being really accepted and no questions about, who you are. And losing that type of connection can be very, very difficult. And especially when you've invested a lot of time and you've gotten to know these creatures. And I should point out that my friends that do conservation work, I have done foundation work with animals, or animal rights work or animal welfare work, are similarly affected, even though they may not have direct personal experiences with an individual animal. So there's something sort of numinous about our relationships with animals. And part of me isn't really concerned about unraveling that mystery so much as just really enjoying it and appreciating it and understanding that we have a moral responsibility to caring for these creatures.
Wildlife conservationists can have a connection with those animals even if they haven't met them.
Exactly.
Yeah, and then when they lose those animals, again, even though they haven't met them, there's this bond that's formed, and there can be grief that results.
Sure.
And
Sure.
so what is the impact of that grief? So whether we're talking about, the losing all those animals to factory farming, or if we're talking about the veterinarian that has to put down a client or a patient that he's had for 15 years, what is the impact of grief on mental well-being and compassion fatigue and compassion stress?
Well, so in the field of what they call thanatology, death, dying, and bereavement, this is I appreciate you asking this question because there's a lot of misunderstanding around that issue. So anytime there's a loss, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a death, but in this case, that's what we're talking about. Anytime there's a loss, our reality is shifted. Our narrative, our story that we had is changed sort of forever. And the goal with navigating grief and navigating loss is to readjust our reality to absorb that loss. So how do we find meaning moving forward? How do we make meaning of relationships or situations that were in the past that were dear to us in a reality where those things don't exist anymore? So I think effectively handling it in veterinary medicine or conservation or whatever field we're talking about revolves around a couple of things. If the loss is massive, for instance, when they had the recent porcine endemic diarrhea outbreak in the US, lots of pork producers lost animals and the veterinarians were affected by that. Lots of compassion fatigue and lots of grief and loss around that. So the question is, how do we find a way to go back and sort of celebrate what was there, retain the good memories, build on what we learned from that, and incorporate that into our lives moving forward? Sometimes we get moving very quickly and we don't take time to stop and process those losses. And I think that's the classic story you'll hear is about having a very difficult euthanasia and then having to leave that exam room and pop into a room with a happy new puppy exam. And how do you switch emotionally those gears? I think a lot of us tell ourselves that we're going to go back and revisit those griefs later and often don't do that. So really, one of the rules of thumb that's helpful is literally setting aside 15 minutes a day to just do some active grieving. That could be journaling, writing, talking. And then the good news is about 85% of people that are suffering losses manage that just fine on their own over time. They don't need professional help to maneuver those kinds of losses. But certainly taking the time to do that and also talking to other people that have perspectives that can be helpful to you. That community support, we know that social support when people are grieving is one of the most important things as well. And I'm an extrovert, so that's easy for me to find. But for introverts, and a lot of people in the veterinary profession are introverts, it can be harder sometimes to reach out and to find those resources of social support.
And would you agree that, here we are almost 2017, and I think that animal grief is a lot more accepted than maybe it was, 10, 20 years ago. But do you find that there are still people that feel that maybe their grief is something that isn't normal and therefore they don't, maybe reach out for that help or feel that they can, actively grieve?
Yes. Absolutely. And I see this frequently with my clients with whom I do bereavement support work. And that happens in the professional realm as well. So there's a term called disenfranchised grief. You've probably heard it before, but it is those presumed losses that are not noted to be that important by society and therefore not in really deserving to have time and energy and emotional resources put into dealing with them. So I think it's changing, which is really gratifying to see. Some of my clients and clients of colleagues, losing a companion animal, for instance, can be one of the biggest losses that they ever suffer. And it's just one of those things that is so. And most of those clients are absolutely stunned when they find that out. They've lost parents, they've lost children, they've lost siblings, they've lost spouses or significant others. And when they lose a pet and that affects them more deeply, they're really troubled by that and they think that there's something wrong with them. So if there's one message I could leave with your listeners, It's that just is what it is, and that's normal, and that doesn't indicate any kind of abnormality or mental illness. It's just that losses resonate with us differently, and we often don't understand why that is.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. I've sat across many of my own clients who tell me, my gosh, I didn't grieve this hard when my mother died or my brother died, and I think it really comes back to that. Not to simplify this, but it really comes down to that unconditional love. There is something very, very powerful about that.
I agree. And the other thing that I see is people that have had conflicted relationships with other people in their lives, and sometimes difficult or traumatic or abusive. I tend to see that pattern perhaps more. And the comment I get from some of my clients is, I just have a problem trusting people and really, truly, fully loving and bonding to people, but easy to do with my dog or cat. So that's another sort of nuance to that. And when people tell me they're grieving in a really, as you said, hard way with an animal, that's one of my clues to kind of help explore their backgrounds and find out why that might be, because helping them make meaning of why it's so difficult for them with the loss of an animal, I think is important in helping them move forward as well.
Yeah, and I would say that in many cases, at least with my experience and my clients, is that oftentimes, a lot of stuff is dug up. You say they lose a dog as an adult, we take them back and it's, we find out that in early childhood, they had a very difficult time with a pet loss, say when they were 5 and maybe mom and dad said, well, we'll just get another dog, or, you don't cry. It was just a dog, something like that. And then I think that kind of instills shame in a lot of people, and this belief that, your grief is not validated.
Exactly. And one of the beauties of the work that you're doing, and that those of us that work in the field of bereavement support and compassion fatigue education and work, is that the word is getting out. And I think as we role model that for other people, telling these stories isn't that easy. And so the more people are able to come forward, I think social media has been a tremendous benefit to everybody, because those stories are out there. People can read them, they can be affected by them, they can benefit from them, and they don't necessarily have to engage anybody in a conversation around them if they're not comfortable doing that. But there's so much out there in the media now and the social media that normalizes this. And same thing with compassion fatigue. Nobody used to talk about it. It was the dirty little secret. The more we talk about it, the more we demystify it, the more we normalize it, the more opportunity people have to just incorporate that into their lives and into their experiences and find the comfort that they need.
Exactly. And here you are an expert in your field, and, you are not immune. I am not immune to compassion fatigue. And so what are some of the ways that you personally manage compassion stress or compassion fatigue these days?
Well, I have created a pretty large toolbox for myself, because I find that what might work for me last year isn't necessarily working for me this year. So I do, because I work with other people professionally, I do an ongoing personal self-care program that involves working with a counselor, because that's just the ethical thing for me to do. So that's really helpful, because for an hour, it's all about me and I can talk about anything I want. So I enjoy that. I try to make sure that I'm eating properly, that I get some exercise, that I'm staying flexible. There's Sandra Martin did an 8-dimensional model of self-care that I really like. And I've created little care sheets for each of those dimensions. And I think that's probably available online. If you need that link, I can get it for you. So looking at the totality of our lives, I might be stressing about work, in which case I might focus on my professional life a little bit. Or I might be stressing about this time of year, there was a lot of loss in our family, so I'm feeling particularly emotional. And so I'm going back and I'm reviewing photographs and letters and reminiscing with people. So it kind of depends on the time of year for me. I love body surfing. I love walking in the forest and the beach. I love yoga. I love music. I love dancing. I love just being out in nature, visiting with friends. So obviously I can't do all of those things in one day, but I try to pick a couple of things, sometimes even a hot bath. I love simple things. I know this sounds strange, but going for a massage, or when I get my hair done, having somebody shampoo my hair, I try to really pause in those moments when things are pleasurable or beautiful or emotive and enjoy them, because otherwise those moments are gone too fast.
And I really like how you kind of personalize that. So, I think having a self-care plan is so crucial, but allowing that plan, like you said, to be flexible, to kind of reflect what's going on during that time of the year, or maybe the mood you're in or the circumstances. And so what advice would you have for someone who's listening right now who maybe is thinking, well, I'm interested in working with animals, or I just started working with animals, and I'm not really, I haven't really experienced much of what they're talking about with his compassion fatigue yet. So what would you recommend to someone who is thinking about making a career out of working with animals? So would you really stress that people start to kind of incorporate a self-care plan now?
Absolutely.
Yeah, as
Absolutely.
proactive. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And so one of the recommendations is that it has to be pretty specific. And again, if you need a reference, there's a podcast that I did for American Veterinary Medical Association that talks a little bit about compassion fatigue and how to manage that and what that might look like for people. So if folks are really interested, you and I can talk about getting some references out there to folks. Couple of things. One, it's best probably to actually formalize this, and that can be made to be fun. So you find a buddy that is working in an animal care profession, perhaps that you already know, or that you develop that relationship once you start working in that arena. And then also a personal buddy or friend, because this way you can help keep each other kind of honest with regard to your self-care. So if I've gone a week without eating until 2:00 and I'm checking in with my sort of self-care buddy, they can say, dude, what's the deal? You're supposed to be eating breakfast. How are we going to remedy that? And help get you back on track and have that be a touchstone. So having a buddy, having a formalized plan, and being gentle with yourself and being flexible and understanding that, I hate to admit this, sometimes, I'll binge on potato chips. And I'll feel bad about it when I'm doing it, but I don't make a habit of it. And if I do that once a month or once every 2 months, I'm going to cut myself a little slack about that. If it becomes a pattern, then I'm going to stop and say, what's going on here? I think the same is true of the animal care professions. The other thing I would say is to really examine why you want to work with animals and try to understand if that's, again, because you care about providing care for them, you're interested in science, you're interested in working with people, you're inevitably going to be working with people. If the only reason you want to work with animals is because you like them, you like doggies and kitties and horsies, and then that sometimes can get us into problems. So have a specific goal in mind about what you want to do. Then you'll know what you're set up to be exposed to, and then you can get some preventative and self-care measures in place.
Excellent advice. And I really like how you mentioned, in addition to self-care, having a little compassion for yourself as well as support. I think support is absolutely imperative.
I agree. And I'll tell you what, the folks that have stood by my side through the years have come sometimes from the most unexpected places. So that's the beauty of working in these fields with other folks who care about animals and the environment and how we all interact together. Some of the most fabulous people. I've been doing this work for over 30 years, and it just keeps getting better. So I can tell people, if they care for themselves and they really invest in what they're doing in an animal care field, it can be spectacularly amazing. You will pinch yourself every day wondering how you got so lucky to be doing this work.
So in other words, that compassion satisfaction factor can be very high.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. So Carrie, is there anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners?
So I think the only other thing I would mention, one of the things that I would love to start seeing is more businesses and groups and organizations bringing these issues to the forefront. There's so many different components to compassion fatigue and what we can do in organizations and businesses to try to lay the groundwork for health for their workers and for their leadership. So one of the issues that I see, and I do a lot of international work as well, is that people are thrust into situations that are difficult, responding to a disaster, responding to an animal disease outbreak. You've seen these situations where it's discovered that there are hundreds of animals kept in a puppy mill or something like that. People sometimes are not prepared ahead of time for what they may encounter. So having organizations that say your health and wellness and safety are our primary goal, and then sort of putting their money where their mouth is and really getting programs and support in place for people ahead of time so they know what to do to keep themselves healthy. They know how they might react if they're exposed to or experiencing particularly difficult circumstances, what they can actually do in that moment to manage some of that, and then what they can do afterwards to continue to work with that and resolve or even sort of reposition their thinking around things that they may have seen. If you worked at a disaster site or worked in countries in particular where there's a lot of poverty, or worked in conservation where species are disappearing, or worked where there's a lot of abuse, it really does permanently change your worldview. And being able to have a way to understand that over time without being destroyed by it emotionally is really, really important. I think organizations could be doing a lot more to help with that. And we know that if they do, they'll retain high quality employees for a much longer period of time. Productivity goes up, safety at work goes up. It's a win-win all the way around.
Absolutely. I think you really touched on an excellent point. You think of first responders such as firefighters and police officers. They have these plans in place. There's crisis intervention and debriefing sessions. And I think, you think of veterinarians and maybe animal control officers that are essentially also first responders. And oftentimes we don't have these policies in place.
Exactly right. And, the tools are pretty simple. You mentioned first responders. Critical incident stress management debriefings are phenomenal. And what I love about that type of approach, anything where you are empowering people, especially within their peer groups, to discuss and build relationship around issues that they face and incidents that they've been exposed to. And you're facilitating that. So you're helping people develop a skill set. Everybody can develop these skill sets. They don't need to go to a psychotherapist or a counselor, although that's beneficial at some times. Anybody can develop these skill sets. And what I love is, as I'm sure you know, these skills transfer across the totality of our lives. So they're not just specific for the work that we do, but we can develop those skill sets there and then translate them when we have other losses or other difficult challenges in our lives, perhaps related to caring for a sick child or an elderly parent.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Carrie, what is the best way for people to learn more about what you do or perhaps get in touch with you?
So probably the easiest way is through my website. It's LaJeunConsulting.com. And I'm guessing you probably can provide that reference to folks. My phone number is available online in most places as well. And that's probably the best way a direct message would come to me. They can also email me directly at LaJeunConsulting@gmail.com. There's some general information on my website about what I do, but I'm happy to talk to folks individually as well if they're interested in learning more.
Excellent. And I will be sure to put those links up on our show notes. And you also mentioned the self-care tips. So I will also put a link for our listeners up on the show notes as well for that. Carrie, thank you so much for all your insight and for taking the time to talk to us today. Really appreciate
Jennifer, it's been my absolute pleasure. I'm really grateful that you're getting the news out there. It's exciting. It's exciting to see that this will hopefully have a big impact. Appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you again, Carrie. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Well, I really hope that you enjoyed today's podcast and our discussion with Dr. Carrie LaJeunesse. If you would like more information and resources, please head over to the show notes on the CompassionFatiguePodcast.com. Also, if you would please do me a huge favor, in order to get this podcast into the ears of so many of our colleagues that I really think would benefit from it, if you could head over to iTunes and not only subscribe, but also if you could just leave an honest review of this show, that will really help to boost our visibility and to reach so many people in the animal community that I think could benefit from this. I would really appreciate that. And I'd like to thank you once again for listening to the Compassion Fatigue podcast. I really hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I look forward to having you join us next week, as well as to become part of this community. Have a great week, you guys. Take care. Thank you for listening to the Compassion Fatigue podcast. Please note that this podcast is not meant to provide medical advice or substitute for psychological care. Please consult with a mental health professional if you need additional support.